Morning, coaches. Welcome to today's e-workshop. Today we will talk about basics of strength training, its importance, principles, and movement progressions. Okay, before we start, a couple of housekeeping matters. We have muted all your mic. However, you can still provide your comments, your questions via the Zoom chat box, which we encourage you to do so. And then we also encourage you to also switch on your screen for better engagement with the presentation and also the presenters. Okay, a bit of background about today's workshop. Okay, we all know that strength training is a key component, a very important piece in athlete development. So how as coaches, how can we design, how can we understand the basic principles of strength training so that we can better help athletes build the strength that they require to excel in their sport? So today we'll hear from our strength and conditioning experts from Singapore Sports Institute, Mr. Ronald Joseph and Mr. Kelvin Chua. So both of them have a few years of experience working at SSI with high performance athletes from various sports. So without further ado, let us welcome Ronald and Kelvin. Okay. Thank you.
Very good morning to all. My name is Kelvin, and today I have my colleague Rano, who will be sharing importance of strength as well as some movement progressions for youth athletes generally. So before we start, maybe we just want to work with a simple. We just have a simple question. Hang on, let me just share my screen. So maybe I can get a favor from you guys. What I want you to do is go into the internet, log into www.menti.com or menti.com, and then I want you to input the code 2854875. So 2854875. So we have this question. We just want to just kind of get your feedback as well, to have a look what comes to your mind when you think of the word strength training. Right? So what comes to your mind when you think of strength training? So log in to the page. You can key in a few words, a few vocabs. What comes to your mind when you think of the word strength training? It'll be really interesting to see what the views of the audience are at this point of time before we actually get presentation started, so that we can have a sensing basically. Okay, nice. See the word power. So just go into the page menti.com and then key in the code 2854875 and then key in the words that come to your mind. Nice. More words are starting to come in. That's good. Keep them coming. So from what we understand, the bigger words, the bolder words basically over here, the size of the words, it kind of shows the number that has been input. So most of you think strength training, when it first comes to your mind, you think about power. We have injury prevention there as well. We have muscle. And then we also have things like your reps. We have things like your heavy weights, ability to manage body weight. That's the nice one. Physical conditioning makes me slow. Fitness. Nice. That's a good one. Thanks, people. So this actually gives us an idea of pretty much what your idea of strength training is, to kind of allow us to kind of adapt a little as to how we can gonna make our presentation as well. So I'll now pass on to RJ, who will be speaking to you about the importance of strength training. RJ, please.
Hi guys, just gonna check that you guys can hear me and that you can see my screen. All right, cool. Hi, my name's Ronald, and like what Chuan Yong said, I've been around here with Cal for a few years. It was interesting to see what you guys put on the Mentimeter. And I guess the most common word was power. Pretty interesting to see that. So before we go into any of that, I guess what I'm going to touch a little on is on the importance of strength training. So in other words, I guess I'm the most boring guy today because Cal's going to be the one doing all the interesting stuff, right? But before we get into the practical bits of it, I think we just want to highlight a couple of points. One, the theory behind the practice is important as well. So you understand where we're coming from and why strength training is important. There's a misconception, or there are conceptions that spread across the spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, you have we find coaches who find it very valuable. On the other end of the spectrum, we find coaches who disregard it. Then, of course, you always have the in-betweens where you have a blend of coaches who give a lot of time to it, who don't give as much time to it, who find the sweet spot, so on and so forth. So I guess one thing we want to share or be clear about is why it's important in a sports setting. That's one. Two, it's a bit hard to do the practical side of this workshop through a Zoom screen. So bear with us later. We'll try and get it across in as best a way possible. Of course, it would be a lot more ideal if it was on the ground, which is what it was when we first ran this workshop. But we'll see what we get out of today, and let's see how we can work through that. All right, so let's go. So the importance of strength training. I guess what is strength? It's simply defined as the ability to produce any kind of external force against an external load. So if you were to stand right beside me right now, and if I push you, I'm simply producing a force against an external load because you are the external load and I'm producing that force to push you away from me. So it's as simple as that. What happens when strength training occurs? Let me just get my cursor on. Okay, so complex graph, etc., so on and so forth. Pretty much what happens is as you start to strength train, if you look at the hypertrophy line where my cursor is running, you gain a bit of muscle mass. If you look at the dotted line, there are neural adaptations. So we have to think of the body as being a unit. The body isn't just made up of muscle, it's made up of an entire system. And one of the adaptations that come out of strength training aren't just with muscle, but neurologically as well. So we're talking about the brain adapting to that strength training as well. And then finally, obviously, of course, with strength training, you see increments in strength. The thing about most training studies and why the slide is up here is that in literature or in science, most of the time you look at this first part over here, right? And we see that things improve pretty nicely within most training studies where they occur maybe anywhere between 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks. But the reality of it is that training studies are short-term, and it's hard to have training studies that are really long. But if you're really talking about adaptations happening over a period of time or seeing the real effects of strength training over a period of time, then it needs to go beyond your training study period into this bracket over here where you see the most serious strength trainers. Right, but in essence, this is what happens in a strength training program. You see improvements really quickly at the start. Over time, they start to peter out a little bit slowly, especially if the program is not changed or if the program is too monotonous. So as team, or not, I shouldn't say team sports, as most sports, or in most sports as athletes, we we're interested in doing things quickly. The term speed kills, I'm sure a lot of us have heard it, exists pretty strongly across the athletic world. So team sports, most individual sports, you want to be able to do things quickly. I'm generalizing here. You want to be able to do things strongly and yet do it quickly. And the thing about strength training and how it plays a part in this is that, well, to put it simply, the stronger you are, you have a greater potential. I use the word potential to express a higher rate of force development. In other words, the stronger you are, there is a potential to produce this force faster. So that's one of the reasons why strength training plays a huge part as well in an athlete's career. So then the next question is strength training or power training? I mean, speed kills, right? We want to be fast, we want to be powerful. So which one do we do? Do we do strength or do we do power, right? Is there room for both, or should we just focus on one? Needless to say, if we look at the box over here, this blue box here, if you're untrained, well, obviously, that's where you are at the bottom line. If we look at the heavy resistance training, which is the heavy strength training, and we look at this line over here, which is the explosive ballistic strength training, you can see that they are different at different time points. So at the 200 millisecond mark, we see that explosive or ballistic strength training tends to have a bit of an advantage over heavy strength training. But if we go to this 250 bracket over here, right, we see that heavy strength training has a bit of an advantage over explosive or ballistic strength training. So what's the difference? What matters? Which should we do? Generally speaking, the newer you are, or the weaker you are, you're probably, I wouldn't say it wholesale, but you're probably better off going off with maximal strength training or building up your maximal strength capacities. Whereas for other people who might be more experienced or more developed, power training seems to make a greater impact. So the question as to strength or power training is pretty dependent on your training status as an athlete. A newer athlete may benefit more from building up his or her strength capacity, whereas a more experienced athlete may benefit more from switching that focus from strength to power. So it could be heavily related to your training status. Right, and again, strength or power training, and we see that there were similar improvements in jump performances across both groups. If you don't look at the graphs, don't disregard the graphs, but the bottom line is, generally speaking, weaker individuals should kind of address increasing their strength capacities first before they look into developing their power potentials or power capacities. Beyond that, having a stronger strength base or having a base with the slower movements also serves as a base for the more complex movements that come with your power-related exercises over time. Now, I'm not saying it is a case of I must do strength and then I do power, but what I'm saying is that having that base as a strength trained athlete, or having that base with strength trained movements, serves as a good base when you move on to your power components as well. All right, strength is the foundational biomotor ability, right? A stronger athletes generally are faster, have the potential to be more powerful, and are more resistant to injury. If you look at the last line, if you train for endurance before getting strong, well, in a way, you're training to endure being weak. And we'll see a little bit of this as we go along. Okay, so lots of things on the screen. But what you will see, if you look at the center of the screen and at the top of the screen, is that you have this component called strength or maximal strength. And you'll see that it leads to an entire spectrum of biomotor abilities. Hence, again, highlighting how strength plays a huge part in a lot of your components over here. If you're talking about power, you're talking about endurance, talking about agility, speed, etc. In a way, strength is the foundational biomotor ability that links to all of these aspects. So I guess as coaches, then the question that we have is, does strength training transfer to our sport? Does strength training transfer to sport skills? Does strength training make me kick the ball better? Or does strength training make me shoot the ball better? Or does strength training help me pass the ball better? It's hard to be entirely specific, but we'll give it a go. All right, so what we do know is that strength training does transfer to sprinting, which is very time-based. It has a huge transfer to change of direction abilities, and it has a huge transfer to jumping abilities, right? So just by essence of that, we've already cut down a lot of factors because a lot of our sports involve us sprinting. A lot of our sports involve us changing of directions, and a fair few sports as well involve the need to jump. So just by looking at these three components, we know that strength training does transfer to general sports skills. But what about specific sports skills? Interestingly, some studies have found that strength training has transferred to certain performance aspects with golf and kayaking. Right, and now we look at time-based sports. We look at endurance running. If you guys want to take a picture, you can take a picture. Right, we see that a strength training has an effect on endurance running. Okay, it's improved 10K run time, it's improved run economy, improved 5K run time and economy, etc. Right, and then if we go on to the next slide, again, so this infographic is designed by YLM Sports Science, which some of you might be familiar with by now, right? And what they found was 2 sessions of strength training during the preseason period and maintaining 1 session during the week allowed running economy to improve and velocity at VO2 max as well. Another infographic, effects of a sport-specific max strength and conditioning training on 5 km race performance. And again, you see that the benefits of strength and conditioning training do have an impact on endurance sports. Okay, and then again, we go to another time-based sport. We talk about strength training on swimming. And we can see on the screen, certain studies have shown that certain kinds of strength training do have a result in improved swim times. Right, again, another time-based sport, we look at rowing. Rowing time or work done on erg rowings also was shown to improve. So, and sprinting. Right, again, another time-based sport, and we can see that strength training has resulted in certain improvements over sprint times over a certain distance. All right, so I guess at the end of the day, while majority of the studies have shown changes in time-based sports, which it is easier to show as compared to, let's say, a team sport per se, we know that strength training does transfer not just to time-based sports, but to skills that are important in team-based sports or other sports as well. Like I said, quite a few of our sports involve the ability to, or the need to sprint. Quite a few of our sports involve the need to change directions. And quite a few of our sports need the ability to jump. And in the context like that, strength training does transfer to those general sports skills. Right, so we've talked about why strength is important. And then we kind of led into how strength does transfer to certain sports skills. And I guess now we talk about the misconceptions about strength training will slow me down or make me stiff. And I don't think I need to talk about the people in the pictures. We know who they are. All right, so we put into a local context, Mervyn from kayaking, Curtis from track cycling, Amanda from swimming. And if you look at the right side of the screen, you'll see their strength scores increasing as time went by. And you'll see that their results in terms of performances as well got better over time. So let's just take a look at Amanda, a 50-meter sprint swim queen. And if you look at her SEA Games 2015 versus 2017, what we see is that her time got faster from 2015 to 2017, and we can also see that her weighted pull-up scores increased from 2015 to 2017. So did it slow her down or did it make her stiff? Not necessarily so. I do want to point out, though, at this point of time, that it is not a one-size-fits-all. All Amanda did from 2015 to 2017 was not just purely strength training, obviously. And it was a combination of various kinds of trainings, a whole training program. So just keep that in mind. Now, strength training does not make you stiff. However, we want to take note that when we talk about strength training in this context, we're not just talking about really heavy stuff only. We're also talking about heavy stuff that progress to power components, doing things for experienced athletes that involve producing huge amounts of force, but rather quickly, right? And that in essence is power, right? So I'm putting this in there because just to be careful, I don't want this misconception that the only thing we need to do is heavy strength training. We have to take note that, especially as we get more experience, quite a few of our sports require us to be fast, powerful. Like I said, speed kills. And that heavy strength training needs to translate into faster movements eventually down the road. So this is just something that that I thought I'd share from a mental perspective. So as coaches, we tend to be really developed or really focused on our skill and our sport. Now, I've primarily been playing team sports most of my life. And I guess, so if you look at the examples over here, they're pretty much related to team sports primarily. So if as a team sport player, I'm pretty interested in having the ability to pre-scan. I'm interested in having the ability to make decisions. I'm interested in having the ability to pass, dribble, shoot. I want to be good at my tactics. I want to have the ability to be thinking 1 or 2 steps ahead of my opponents. So these are skills that you develop that are very specific to the sport. And I think as coaches, that is our primary bread and butter. However, if we talk about investments, this line, in investments, you are encouraged to diversify, or diversification is encouraged in investing, of course, depending on which investor you're talking to. But generally speaking, the word diversification is common in the investment circles. I guess what I'm trying to say here today is that I encourage you to diversify, to not put all your eggs in one basket. Yes, your sport and the skill of the sport are of primary importance at the end of the day. But if this is all that we focus on, or if this is all that we invest in, then we're kind of forgetting that there are many more baskets that we can actually diversify into. And while we have our skill in sport, we have the mental skills aspect. Now we have the physical requirements of sport. And I guess at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is don't put all your eggs in one basket. You know what? Split them out. Another infographic from YLM Sports Science. And in essence, what this infographic is saying that strength training undoubtedly is important. And you know what? It helps in minimizing or reducing the risk of soft tissue injuries. It also helped in minimizing time lost due to injury. And again, another study, again, strength training reduces sports injuries to less than 1/3. So again, trying to sort of back up the point or to solidify the point where you go, don't put all your eggs in one basket, invest in other matters that are related to your abilities as a coach or what's necessary for your sport as well. Right, and we're almost there, guys. Just bear with me. Kelvin's going to come in pretty soon and take over the interesting parts. This is a theoretical relationship between strength and sports performance. Again, I emphasize the word theoretical. Kelvin will touch a little bit on that later. Right, so please, theoretical, right? It's not cast in stone. But what we do know, generally speaking, theoretically, is that if, for example, if you're talking about a back squat, and if you're able to squat 2 times of your body weight, and in some places they found that it's 2.2, you start to actually gain a lot more performance benefits if you can hit this zone over here. And that's when you start to really see performance benefits translating out of that 2 times body weight of your squat. Now, again, I emphasize that this is theoretical. It's really nice to be able to hit 2 times your body weight. That is the best case scenario or something higher. I do want to point out, though, that it takes a long time to get an athlete up to 2 times of your body weight. So yes, is this the zone that we want to see? Ideally, yes, because that's when, you, like I said, you start to see greater performance benefits. But it does not mean that just because we need a long time to get up to 2 times body weight, we're not going to waste time, we're not going to bother, because you still see certain benefits even within this zone in the center over here. Okay, so a paper by Tim Sukumel, Sofia Nymphas, Mike Stone. These guys were huge names in the sports science industry who also have pretty high levels of experience working with really high level athletes internationally. All right, and again, you can take a photo. You can find this on the net. I've just put it up here to sort of sum up why muscular strength is really important and useful when it comes to athletic performance. All right, so before I end off, a little quote. Strength training should not and will not replace skill. I think the challenge sometimes we have with coaches, or coaches have with us, would be that, you know what, I want my sport to get better. I'm not here to make powerlifters. I'm not here to make gym rats. And yeah, we totally agree. As strength and conditioning coaches, while it may be a huge part of your training, it should not and will not replace skill. I mean, the bottom line is to get better at the sport. You need to play the sport more than anything else. But having said that, as explained earlier, why strength is important. It is the foundational biomotor ability of physical fitness, and it will and hopefully should complement the skill in your training programs. So remember, don't put all your eggs in one basket. It would be wise to not neglect it, diversify, expand that base that you can cover as coaches. And with that, you guys don't have to hear from me anymore for a while at least. And I'm going to pass the screen back to Kelvin.
Thanks, RJ. I think he put a lot of pressure on me, saying that this portion of things it's going to be a lot more fun. We'll see about that. The thing with this was that we had a previous run held sometime in February or March. So this portion of things was actually on the practical aspects of things. So this time round is a little different. So unfortunately, we're not able to do the practical aspect of things. But then again, that's not stopping you from doing those practical stuff as I am explaining through the screen online with you. So hang on, let me, how do I do? Okay. Yep. So like I said, again, this portion, I'm going to be focusing on the foundational movement patterns. So there will be some practical aspects of things incorporated in a way, explained. So feel free at the comfort of your place. If you have resistance bands, you have mini loop bands, you have dumbbells, feel free to get it out. You can just stand in front of your computer as I explain, as you look into the pictures, some videos as well. You can start trying out some of these activities as well, because what I'm going to share here today will be pretty much on the practical aspects of things that I think we as coaches can, in a way, incorporate for our athletes. Generally, I'm talking about probably mostly youth over here, maybe even adults, but doesn't matter. Fact is that you have the time, you have to find some space just right in front of you. Feel free to really try things out a little as I explain. So when I talk about, RJ basically talked about the importance of strength. So next, hang on. Okay, next we are going to shift the focus to basically what we as coaches can in a way start to do to develop strength for performance and the reduction in sport injuries. So what we do know is that, again, RJ mentioned, it takes time, experience, and of course, proper planning to be able to, for instance, lift 2 times your body weight, right? So in order to achieve that, foundations have to first be established. So in the next few slides, we will share with you some foundational movement patterns that you could work with maybe your group of athletes to build a good base for subsequent training progressions. So here we are talking about movement patterns that involve your lower body and upper body. So in your lower body, we have your squat pattern. Hang on, let me take out my pointer. So for your lower body, basically we're looking at 3 main movement patterns. We have your squat, we have your hinge pattern, we have your lunge pattern. And then for your upper body, we're talking about two main criteria we're talking about, the pulling and pushing, right? And for each, we are talking about 2 planes of movements as well, in the horizontal plane, this way, as well in your vertical planes, right? So basically, these patterns are basic movements that, in a way, form the foundation of how we move. So basically, what happens during sporting activities is that forces are being generated and absorbed, right? For instance, doing a vertical jump, your lower limb actually produces the force to propel our body up in the air. And then as we land, forces again are absorbed by the body, by the muscles. So basically, we need these structures to be strong to first be able to, in a way, produce the required force. And second, to be also strong enough for us to sustain the external forces. In this case, we're talking about landing, or in some other sports, we're talking about maybe in collision sports, such as maybe rugby, we're talking about collision with other athletes as well, to be able to sustain the external forces. So therefore, training these movement patterns will in a way work to strengthen major muscle groups, which in turn will contribute to the translation of performance and also the hopefully the reduction in sport injuries. So in the next few slides, I will go a little more into each movement pattern and some simple exercises that can be in a way incorporated, also along with some coaching cues to aid the movements. Okay, so this is the first movement pattern. So this is the squat movement pattern. We are talking first in the lower limb. So lower limb, we are looking at 3 categories. First, I'll touch on the squat movement pattern. So this is a very, very commonly used movement pattern. Some of you coaches probably even use this as part of complement to your training. So getting athletes to do maybe 3 sets of 10 squats and things like that. So this generally, again, involves your lower body, although loaded variations of this movement also involve your abdominal core. So basically, it's also like a core exercise. So training of this movement pattern, the squat movement pattern, improves your lower limb strength, which in terms contributes to this thing called the triple extension. So triple extension is actually the extension or straightening motion of your ankles, knees, and hips in sequence. And it happens during various sporting movements like your jumping, your sprinting, say in swimming, you're pushing off a wall, and as well as generally change of direction movement. So this requires this thing called triple extension, the extension of your ankle, knees, and hips. So over here, good cues to be used generally will be to reach your hip rearwards. So in this case, you want to get maybe your athlete, the person, to reach the hip rearwards, and then also bend at the knees to get into the squat position. And then another good cue I like to generally use is that you want to get them to imagine there's like a really, really small stool at the back, so it's behind them, and you want to get the athlete to try to take a seat. So this is the squat movement pattern. So here, what we also want to look out for is that generally the feet should be in contact with the ground throughout the squat motion. So here I'm talking about having your feet set up in a tripod position with 3 points of contact. So one will be on the heel, one will be on your ball of the feet, and then one will be on the lateral side of your foot, right? So what you want to look out for is having this 3 point of contact as the athlete is doing the squat movement itself. And we also want to allow the knees to drive outwards so that we can kind of actively engage your gluteal muscles. So next up, we have some exercises to kind of encourage such movement. So what we have here is a mini band. So mini band are just really small resistant bands that you can get readily outside. And then what you do is have the mini band loop just above your knee, and then getting the athlete to do a certain movement. So what this does is that it actively allows the individual to push against the resistance. So basically drive the knee outwards to go into the squat pattern itself. And then once they get comfortable with the movement itself, we can in a way progress that into a goblet squat format. So either with a band or with weights. So bands, we will be basically stepping and holding onto the band. And then if you're doing weights, we can either use I've used backpacks before, and then you can use heavy water bottles as well. And of course, if let's say you have dumbbell, you can just get the weight just right in front of you to get that movement pattern itself. So basically this movement pattern, this squat movement pattern, it involves your simultaneous flexion of your, simultaneous bending or flexion of your hips and your knees. So you want to get your athlete to a low enough position that allows your athlete to still keep a flat back or generally a neutral spine. So here I also want to kind of in a way address the topic on knees going past toes. I think this is like a misconception that has been ongoing, I mean, even till now. So we have a lot of coaches advocating when getting people to squat, your knees shouldn't go beyond your toes. So should that be the case? So think about it. Should that be the case? Should my knees go beyond the toes, just like that? So as you think about that, what I want you to do is try now. I believe most of you are seated right now. So what I want you to do is try from your seat, get up and stand up. Okay, from your seat, just get up and stand up. And then what I want you to keep a focus on is on your knees and your toes, right? Because since we're on this topic, we're talking about knees and toes. So have a good sensing of that. And then I believe if, let's say, you try getting the toes as far forward as you can, and then trying to stand up, you will find you'll find that you're being stuck because you are not being able to generate that force sufficiently to push your weight up. So basically, again, back to this topic on knees going past toes, it is only natural and it is generally safe to do so, because in our daily activities of living, in this case, show you an example of basically stepping up from a chair, the knees are already going past the toes, because essentially to be able to produce that force optimally, you need to be able to get in an optimal position to allow you to stand up nicely. So this allows you to basically, in a way, maintain balance. So basically for this squat movement pattern, what you want is that you have your center of gravity over, if you see from the side so basically if you see from the side, you want your center of gravity to be somewhat in line with the midfoot of the middle of your foot, your midfoot. And of course, this also depends on the individual's anthropometry. So what I'm talking about here is your limb length. So generally, if let's say you have a longer femur or a thigh bone compared to maybe your shin bone, there might be a greater tendency of you having the knees past the toe because the fact that you need to be able to maintain your balance to produce that force to stand up. So the thing here is that as long as the feet is planted, so back to the first point, as long as you have that tripod foot positioning, as long as your feet, both feet planted, balance is achieved at the bottom of the squat, it is okay. Because the thing is that we've seen a lot of athletes doing squats having the heel raise. So it could be the fact that the mobility around the ankle hasn't really been established, it's a little tight and things like that. So that kind of limits their ability to go down into the full depth. But then again, is a full depth required? Here and there, depends on your sport. But generally, this is just to talk about the misconception of having that knees past the toes. Okay, so that pretty much sums up that first movement pattern itself. This is the squat movement pattern. So I hope you get to try out a little on this movement pattern as well, because this is a very, very basic and fundamental movement pattern that everybody should kind of, in a way, get. Okay, moving on to the list of the next movement pattern in the lower limb, we have the, hang on, let me, so moving on to the next item on the list, we have the hinge movement pattern. Okay, again, this involves the lower body. Again, loaded variations of this movement will also work your core. So this hinge movement is as important as the squat because it also contributes to the triple extension motion that I talk about that is very, very prominent in very common in many sports. So here, good cues generally to use will be to keep the chest up. And then what you want to do is to reach the hip rearwards, so reach the hip backwards without the knees bending too much. So over here, have a good look at the knees. There's not too much of a bending, not too much of a flexing of the knees. And then at the bottom, what you want to do is stand back up by pushing away from the ground. Another cue that I kind of like to use is that you want to imagine that you're trying to greet your teacher. You want to, in a way, take a bow. So that's also one of the cues that you can kind of work with as well. So here, for the hinge pattern, what we want to look out here is that a hinge is not a squat. So there are differences between a squat and a hinge. So even though both requires you to keep almost an upright trunk, there is a difference in terms of that shin angle. So for the squat, you're having more of a lean of the shin as opposed to the hinge. Remember, we are not having too much movement around the knees so that we are loading more of this joint, right? So basically there's minimal knee movement in the hinge compared to the squat. So some exercises to kind of work with here is that the first one, you want to have like a long resistance band. So over here, what you can do is tie the band to a strong and steady structure. You don't want to tie that to your shoe rack. You want to tie that to something really strong and steady so that you can really move safely as well. So what you want to do, have that pull through. So this is the band goes just in between your legs. And then from here, you want to allow the body to come down. So keeping the chest up as you lean forward. And then when you come back up, what you're trying to do is push away from the ground so that we engage your glute muscles as you're coming up in the movement. So as we progress, you can also work with a band RDL. So RDL stands for Romanian deadlift. So over here, it's pretty much the same concept, but what you're trying to do here is you work with a resistance band as well. But over here, you are stepping on the band. And then what you want to do here, pack the body tight. Same thing, keep the chest up, lean forward as you reach your hip rearwards. And then push yourself off the ground to stand up. So here, common issue is that athletes will generally arch. Athletes will generally arch or bend at the low back. So I'm talking about this portion of the back that low back. So they will generally have an arch, have a bend, rather than focusing on the movement on the hip. So for this movement pattern, what we want to do is to work with an anterior hip tilt for this hinge movement. So what this means is that the anterior hip tilt basically means a forward hip tilt movement. So we're going to try out an activity. So I understand all of you basically will be right now are sitting down. So what I want you to do is try as much as you can with your index finger. What I want you to do, reach down towards the front of your hip. So what I want you to feel is for a bony structure just on the front of your hip. It should roughly be where the hip bends or just above it. So where the hip creases, it should be just above it. You should feel a bit of that bony structure. So that is your ASIS bone. So that's basically your hip bone, the front portion of the hip bone. So what I want you to do now, palpate, feel, find that structure. Okay, now you found it. What I want you to do is here, I want you to, in a seated position, slouch and then sit upright. So alternate between these two, I want you to slouch and then sit upright. Okay, try that for a few times. As you do that, you should feel the bony structure in front of the hips. It should be shifting a little. So over here, what we want is that you be in a sit upright position. So in this case, when you're sitting upright, the hip is tilted forward. And then as you slouch, the hip goes backward. So that's a posterior tilt. So for this hinge movement, the focus pretty much is on an anterior tilt. So what I'm talking about here is you want an upright posture as you are doing this movement. So basically the cue for this, as I previously mentioned, will be to keep the chest up. So this basically allows that person to get the chest up. So it's almost like an upright seated position already, which allows the movement at the hip generally. So if let's say that is not done, then generally we get the common issue of them arching at the back, which happens when you are moving from your low back rather than movement from your hip. So again, this is by far the hardest movement to teach. So getting this right takes some time and takes some guidance as well. So as coaches, it is important for us to kind of understand where this movement should come from. It shouldn't be from the low back. It should be from the hip movement itself. Okay, moving on next to the list of the last lower body fundamental movement pattern. So here will be a lunge. It can be a forward, it can be a reverse lunge. So basically this translates to single leg or unilateral limb strength, which generally is critical in sports that demands change of direction and quick push off. So here, good cues to use will be to get the athlete to stay tall and then sink the weight downwards. Then as you, at the bottom of the lunge, what you want to focus on is on pushing off from the front of the leg. Right, so what you want to do is return to the standing position by pushing the front of your leg, either back or getting yourself forward. So for some, it might be difficult to lift the legs off the ground a little to get into either a forward or a reverse lunge. So a good regression to this will be a split squat. So a split squat is when you have both feet planted. So you have your back leg. You can either stay on the ball of your feet or you can have the heel planted as well. Depends on your limb length as well. So what you want to do here is keep an upright torso, sink the weight low until you get your top of the thigh parallel to the ground, and then focusing on that front limb, pushing yourself up to produce the force for you to stand back up. And of course, the next one to kind of introduce will be the multiplanar lunge. So the nature of most sports requires basically athletes to change direction. So many times in many different planes of motion as well. So this lunge can, in a way, effectively work to train the aspect of things. So again, things to focus will be to keep the upright torso because there will be a tendency to sway. So again, this is not just an exercise to really work on your lower limb, but it also works on your ability to balance, to be stabilized, and then to have the coordination to move as well. And on top of your lower limb strength and the core strength required to keep that stability. Okay, so I covered the 3 movement patterns. So for your lower limb, you have your squat, you have your hinge, and then you have your lunge pattern. So next few, I'm going to talk about the upper body movement patterns. So I'll first start off with the push pattern. So for each pattern, we will have basically 2 planes of motion as well. So here, I'm focusing on the horizontal movement. So here, I'm talking about this plane of movement. So horizontal. So over here, you actually see a push-up. So this generally involves the front portion of your upper body, your deltoids, your pecs. I mean, you have the tricep as well, it's on the posterior side, but generally it works this portion of your muscle. So working this horizontal pattern has basically translation to, say, underarm and overhead movement in sports. For example, your tennis forehand, your badminton or volleyball serve, and then overhead patterns like your badminton smash, handball throw, and things like that. So over here, what you want to really focus on is you want your core raise, you want your glute squeeze, and then you want to push yourself up as a unit. So you want to push the whole body, a whole trunk up as a unit. So a push-up generally is a dynamic plank. So a plank is where you hold in that posture with that good straight posture with your ankles, hips, and shoulders stacked in line. So a push-up is basically a dynamic one, which means that in that stacked posture, you're moving those points evenly. So what you want to do is to basically push yourself up as a unit. So especially for youth, it will be challenging at the start because they might not be adapted or they are not strong enough to do certain activities to do this movement, to push themselves up basically. So a good regression to this is called the knee push-up. So what you have here is having the knees rested on the ground. Same concept, what you want to do here is to keep tension by bracing your core and then squeeze your glutes. Then as they progress, you can up them progressively to do an incline push-up. So over here, what this does is that it kind of in a way reduces the liver length. So over here, you're supported on your feet. It's a longer liver length. So over here, it's a slightly easier version. Generally, you're rested on your knees. You will have a slightly shorter liver arm. So in this case, force or moment required to push yourself up will be lesser, making this version easier compared to this version as opposed to maybe just a normal push-up. So here, common issues will be that we generally see will be hips drooping. So this issue is when you don't have tension involved. So I always tell my athletes this, tension is king. Once you lose tension, you lose strength. So over here, what we want to develop is a bit of the ability for the athlete to understand their body, to create that tension so that they can produce the necessary force for them to move a certain resistance. In this case, their body weight, their body mass. So with the hips drooping, what you want to get them to do is pretty much getting them to, again, to brace the core and then to squeeze the glute tight so that they can get a connection between their upper body and their lower limb to push up as a whole, as a unit as a whole. Another common issue here is that as people are doing this, we get a lot of the elbows flaring out. This is also quite an issue because what you want to do, so first issue is that it puts a little bit more of the stress on the shoulder. And then another issue is that it lengthens basically your muscle such that it is not at an optimal length for you to generate the sufficient force to push yourself up. So again, a good way to do that is to get them to kind of tuck their elbows in a little. There will be a little bit of the gap in between their elbows and their torso. So maybe roughly gauge about a 45-degree angle or so, just a little bit of the angle so that the muscles will be in an optimal length to kind of, in a way, produce that force to push themselves up as well. So that's for the horizontal push motion. So now I'm talking about the vertical push motion. So in this case, I'm talking about an upward push, right? So training this push will allow the athlete again to project objects higher and faster in a way. And then of course, to also, it's also especially important for overhead sport athletes to maintain, in a way, shoulder health, because there's so many overhead movement, repeated overhead movement that goes on. You want a bit of that strengthening in this portion of that structure to allow it to sustain the external forces. So here, some good cues to kind of use will generally again be getting them to brace their core, squeezing their glutes. Hang on. Let me play that. Sorry for that. Let me just play that again. So again, this is a vertical push motion. So before they start the pushing motion, what you want to get them to do is to keep their core braced, glute squeeze, and then punch upward into the ceiling. It's not running. I'll just run it a few more times. So generally quite straightforward, movement starting from just right in front of your chest, keeping the core braced, glute squeeze, pushing to the ground. Then you drive the arms upwards into the ceiling. Just a few more times. So again, if you have some objects at home, you want to try out this movement, please feel free, go ahead. Because I understand that we need to try out the movement so that we can better explain to the people we're working with, in this case, maybe the youth, maybe some adult athletes as well, on what to kind of, in a way, focus on. So here, a good regression to that will be, again, here we are trying to use a resistance band. And then what we have is that you are kind of kneeling on the resistance band, and then setting that good posture, keeping that core braced, squeezing that glutes tight, and then pressing up with both arms. And then as we progress, we move on to a more unilateral movement. So which means we're going to use one arm. So here, now we are increasing the tension of the band by increasing the height of the movement that we're trying to do, the distance that is covering. So here you're stepping on the band, and then again focusing on bracing the core and trying to push the weight up. Okay, so that was pretty much the push movement. So push movement, we have again horizontal, vertical. So next I'm going to move on to the pull movement. So these are the last two movements of the upper body, which also concludes that fundamental movement patterns that I'm going to show. So here will be a horizontal pull movement. So this movement in a way involves the back portion or posterior parts of your upper body, targeting generally your posterior deltoids, your middle back, your lats, your latissimus dorsi. So basically training this movement will in a way translate example to maybe say a backhand in tennis or badminton. And of course, more importantly, is to provide much needed balance to the constant pushing motion that's commonly used in sport to give you that good shoulder health. So basically, the back muscles assist in deceleration of an overhead movement. So in a way, what I'm talking about here is that when we're doing take a handball throw, for example, right? So over here, the posterior muscles are kind of the ones working to generate the force for you to kind of do a movement. So what this does is that at the end of the movement, deceleration is required to kind of stop and break your arm. Break as in B-R-A-K-E, not B-R-E-A-K. So here, that back muscles, having strong back muscles, will allow for this deceleration movement of your overhead movement. So it is important to work on strengthening it to maintain good shoulder health. So here, a good cues to work on is that you can see in this position, the model is already in a hinge position. So the hinge pattern that we talk about again, so it's basically a movement from the hip and then getting yourself in this posture. The reason why I'm in this posture is that the pull movement out of all the movement, is generally the hardest to do with minimal equipment, right? So if let's say you don't even have resistance band, you don't have any other equipment, it is very difficult for you to, in a way, if you want to train this movement. So if you have minimal equipment, in this case, I'm talking about say a mat ball or resistance band, it would be nice if let's say you can get into this posture, the hinge posture, so that you can work that pull movement itself. So here, I'm already in a hinge position, facing the core. So what I'm doing here is that I'm initiating the movement from my elbows, bringing it back up, and then squeezing my shoulder blades together at the top of the movement to kind of engage the muscles itself that we're trying to work with. So again, like I said, with minimal equipment, it is pretty hard to find good exercises for this. Even with equipment, it requires you to generally either have a structure to kind of hold. In this case, I'm talking about the band resistance row. So here, what we have is that you want to have a resistance band loop across a steady structure again. So here, you want to set up in a good posture. So you can allow the knees to bend a little if you don't have too much of a flexibility in your hamstrings. So sit upright, chest up. What you want to do here is to set the shoulder in place, so you don't want an arch as you start the movement. So what you want to do, keep the chest up. So this kind of sets the shoulder in place. And then you want to focus on the initiation of the movement from the elbow. So what you want to do, drive the elbows back. It allows you to better engage the back muscles that we're trying to focus for this horizontal pull movement. And then what you can do at the back, squeeze the shoulder blades tight together as you control the movement all the way back. And then another good variation to work with this, again, you saw already the bend over position. So previously was with the medicine ball. So this time around is with the resistance band. So you'll be setting yourself up in a bend over position. So in this case, again, it's that movement from the hip. So shift the hip rearwards, get in a good tight position, and then step over a band, allow the arms to hang, drive your elbows back, squeeze your back, and then control that movement back. So that ends off a little on the pull movement in the horizontal plane. So the next one and the last one for this portion of things will be the pull variation in the vertical plane. So again, it involves the posterior portion of your back. So now we're talking more about your upper back, your deltoid still, your posterior deltoid, your trapezius complex, your latissimus dorsi, your rotator cuff muscles as well. So basically, again, this training this movement pattern will provide that much needed balance in the constant pushing motion that is so commonly used in sport. So we really need to have good strength in the back so that the shoulder can be safe from generally overuse injuries. So here again, this is a normal pull-out variation. So here you want to keep the core braced, stay upright, and then initiate the pull to lift the whole body up. So some few good variations will be working with an eccentric. So eccentric version of things, it's either you're holding an overgraph or undergraph, doesn't matter, it's fine. So what you're doing here is that you're starting your movement at the top of the movement, at the top of the motion, basically. So what you can do is that you can either jump yourself up and then hold yourself there isometrically, and then slowly lower yourself down by counts of 4, by counts of 5, depending on how strong you are as well. So this is a very good variation to start off when you don't really have that strength to kind of start to do an actual pull-up or chin-up. And then another good variation will be a band-assisted chin-up. So here, you can secure a band just right in the middle of a bar, step down fully with your weight. So what this does is that the resistance is going to help your weight up a little as you're doing that movement. So this is another variation that is in a way useful to kind of guide your athletes to start getting a pull up or a chin up done. So what to focus here basically is to prevent that sway. So what you want to work here is that generally when you hang up the bar, there will be a little bit of the momentum and the body kind of starts to sway a little. So what you want to do is to really prevent that. So to do that, you really have to keep tension. So again, tension is king. Once you lose tension, you lose strength. So basically you want to prevent that sway by keeping that core braced, stay upright, and then start and initiate the movement to kind of pull yourself up in a way. So this in a way kind of sums up that basic fundamental movement patterns, the simple 7 movement patterns that everyone should kind of be involved. So this essentially can be, I mean, in a way done in later parts of a young athlete's training stage, because as they get competitive and as they decide to also choose, maybe some of them decide to choose to become national athletes. So these are essential fundamental movement patterns to have so that we can progress them to further things. So the fact is that many gym-based programs are based on progressive loading of these movement patterns, right, to achieve a desired outcome for an individual. So therefore, it's really important for us as coaches to incorporate some of these movement patterns either during the warm-up procedure, during the warm-up period, or cater some time at the end of a session to work with these movement patterns. So now I shall hand back to RJ to share on how things can be progressed based on the principles of training. RJ, back to you.
Okay, cool, awesome. All right, thanks, Kel. You're seeing my screen, right? All right. Shall we just take like a 30-second break, ladies and gents? You've heard quite a bit from Kel and myself for about an hour. So you know what? Just take a 30-second break. Take your eyes away from the screen. Take your eyes away from your phone. Look somewhere else. Walk around in circles wherever you are if you want to. Do a few squats, jumping jacks, and then you know what? We'll crack along again in about 30 seconds. Okay. All right. So as usual, I get to cover the not so interesting bits, whereas Cal gets all the interesting stuff. All right. So again, so Cal ran through the practical side of it. I'm just going to quickly sum up the first part that I talked about, where we talk about the importance of strength. Strength is important. It plays a huge part in minimizing the risk of injury. It plays a huge part in reducing time lost on the pitch. It plays a part in transferring to sports skills, especially general sports skills, sprinting, changes of direction, jumping. It does transfer specifically to certain sports skills, so far as studies have shown. And remember, diversify, ladies and gents. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Okay, so on the next slide, this is just a sample progression of the squat movement that Kel talked about just now. Again, I always say that there are 101 ways to skin the cat. It's not one size fits all, but this is just a very simple sample that you could put into play starting from body weight on week 1, day 1 for the squat movement, and moving all the way to week 6 on the right side of the screen, day 1 and day 2. Right, so you'll see we've started with body weight on week 1, day 1, and by week 6, we've kind of progressed to the barbell and the goblet. All right, so, and these exercises are found in that Back to Basics pamphlet that Cal showed earlier. All right, so I know that most of you here, I see some pretty legendary names in the sporting scene, and I know that a lot of you guys in here have been in the coaching field for years, way longer than we have. All right, so bear with me. I'm going to talk about 5 different principles of training, and I know that in your years of coaching, you've probably heard this millions of times, so don't kill me yet. But I'm going to talk about how, or rather, why these principles matter to you or us from a strength and conditioning perspective. So we've got individuality, we've got specificity, we've got progressive overload, we have diminishing returns, and we have reversibility. And if you go from the right side of the screen to the left, more often than not, we end up like that through stages of life, right? From the right side going towards the left. Or I find myself going in that direction. All right. So how do these principles matter to me, right? And I know some of you are probably looking at the screen and going like, oh my goodness, I heard this in coaching course 101, SG coach level 1, or my sports science degree or my sports science degree. All right. So, but why or how? Why did I put it in here? And how do these principles matter to me? From a strength and conditioning perspective, within a sporting context. So we're not talking about just being a gym rat, being a powerlifter, etc. We're talking about athletes who we're working with. Why is individuality so important? One, athlete A could have very different needs from athlete B, and the why is so important. The principles are so important. It's important to know that John may have a different demand or a different need as compared to Calvin, or Ronald may have a different demand or different need as compared to Mark. And when you plan your programs, even as for your sports, you'll see for yourself that different individuals have different needs that need to be trained, some weaknesses that can be bettered or improved on, some strengths that can be bettered. Likewise, from a strength and conditioning perspective, it's the same thing. If I know that after half a year of working with Mark, he needs a burst out of the blocks, or he needs to be more forceful in his burst out of the blocks, or he needs to produce more force. Or if I know that somebody is really strong, but isn't really that quick, how do I plan my program, or how do I tailor my program around that? So individuality is one of the principles that are going to be really important from that strength and conditioning perspective, like it is for your respective sports as well. Specificity and are the things that you're doing in the gym, or on the field, on the pitch, or within that strength and conditioning environment, are they specific to your needs? Now, I'll be very clear here, because there's that swing about being overly sport specific. If this is the movement that I do in the sport, I must try and replicate that exact movement in the gym. And I just want to, I'm going to put my head out here and say that it is very, very hard to replicate your sports movements entirely or very specifically in the gym. That's one. Two, if you're already practicing these movements so specifically on the pitch or on your court or wherever you are, or wherever your training environment is, sometimes doing too much of it or doing so much of it may not be necessary, and you might actually be better off complementing those movements with other movements in the strength and conditioning environment. So while it's important to be specific, it's important to know what your sport needs. Don't get me wrong. It's important to know what the individual needs. I mean, I'm not going to get so one of the sports that I work with is shooting. I'm not going to get a shooter to squat 100 kilos. I mean, why do I need a shooter to squat 100 kilos, right? It's not specific in that sense. At the same time, I don't necessarily need a shooter to come into the gym and carry a weight that's the same weight as a rifle and get into that position that they are maybe in that air rifle position when they're shooting. Do I need to do that in the gym as well? I don't need to, because, you know, it's already being done in the range. It's already being done numerous times in the range. So why do I need to copy the exact movement and bring it back into that strength and conditioning environment, right? So it's important to be specific, but I think there's a fine line balancing being overly sport specific and being necessarily specific. Diminishing returns. Why is this important? Let me give you a very practical example. If I'm going to do 5 sets of 5 reps of squats at 100 kilos for the first 4 weeks of a program, let's just say, what you might see over time is that I'm starting to get stronger and I'm starting to lift the 100 kilos with more ease, right? Maybe in the first week, it takes me longer to lift the weight. I struggle. Second week, I struggle less. Third week, I struggle even lesser. Fourth week, I'm like, oh, piece of cake. Fifth week, I'm like, let's go, man. This is too easy. But maybe by the time you hit the 6th week, the 7th week, the 8th week, or the 3rd month, or the 4th month, and if you're still doing 5 sets of 5 reps at 100 kilos, how much more do you think that is actually benefiting you? Probably not, because you've been doing the same thing for far too long, and there hasn't been a different stimulus to excite a different kind of change, right? So be wary of the principle of diminishing returns, because do something for too long or do the same thing for too long, and your returns start to get a lot less over time. On the contrary, I also want to point out here that this does not mean, or does not give you an excuse to change your program every 1 or 2 weeks. You know, like you do one program in a week, and then the next week you change it to a program number 2, and then week number 3, program number 3, and you haven't given the program time for you to see the desired change, right? So again, it's a fine line between finding the right amount of time to minimize the diminishing returns. At the same time, it's also a fine line between that and changing the program far too often, because you don't give the program enough time to run its course for it to take its effect. All right, the 4th principle, progressive overload, extremely, extremely important. You need to progress and you need to overload if you want to see changes happening over time. Without that progressive overload, what is a very high likelihood that you'll see your diminishing returns keep diminishing. And the last principle, reversibility, something that you might see or you may have seen in the off season with your athletes. For some of them, you know, once competition finishes or season's over, sometimes you see them like the guy on the right side of the picture of reversibility. But by the time they come back from off season, maybe they're somewhere in the middle, or if there's no checks and balances and no accountability, sometimes they end up like this guy on the far left of reversibility, if you want to take it to the extreme. Right, so 5 different principles, and as they are important in your sport, equally they are important in the strength and conditioning environment as well. So I'm almost there, guys. My main goal for today was to talk about the why or the how, and Kelvin was to talk about the how in a practical sense. We're going to end up with a myth buster, training to failure. You know, sometimes you go into the gym and you've got these huge guys and they're like, bro, got to smash it out today, man. Work until you drop. And then some people are like, hey, come on, you know, let's go. But is that really, really necessary as an athlete? I mean, if you're a gym rat and you just want to train to failure for the sake of the pump and because you want to feel good, it may not be the wisest way, but I mean, look, that's your problem, man. But as an athlete, is it necessary to train to failure? Should we or not? I mean, if you end up looking like this guy, Okay, just kidding. Right, so we define muscular failure as a point where we can no longer perform that concentric phase of the exercise through the required ROM without altering our technique. Basically, it means I can't do the exercise in any clear or proper way. I'm basically doing it in such an ugly manner that, I can barely even get out of it. So this is for you to take a picture. I'm not going to explain it. There are too many variables, too many variations, too many factors. But please screenshot this or take a photo of this and you can have it for your referral. Bottom line, to put it, or the gist of it, should I train to muscular failure as an athlete? You're probably not going to like this answer, but it really depends. And more often than not, and not all the time, but more often than not, you're probably better off not pushing your athletes to train to muscular failure in a strength and conditioning setting. But again, I say more often than not. There are certain times where, because you want to try and elicit something out of your athlete or get a certain adaptation, maybe for a short period within the year, there may be moments where you are pushing your athlete to train to muscular failure. So it really depends. But again, more often than not, you're better off probably staying away from it. But that's a screenshot, ladies and gents. And with that, I think we have, come to the end of our prezzo. I hope if anything, you take away the cues that Cal talked about. And from my end, I remember the why. The why is really important. And the principles as to how to put them into practice. Remember, diversify, don't put your eggs in one basket. And if you have any questions, we'll be here. And John, all yours.
Okay, thanks, Kelvin and Ronald, for this very detailed, in-depth presentation on the basics of strength
I
training.
understand there's one question from the Zoom chat group. So Lawrence was asking, in swimming strength conditioning, what are few key exercises to help in sprinting, turn at wall, and how do you measure improved power and acceleration and reaction time? So I don't really have an answer for the second. So maybe I can address the first point. So in swimming, so the major propulsion forces generally comes from major muscle groups like your pec muscles, your chest muscles, your lat muscles, and of course your lower limb muscles, your quad generally in a way. So those are general muscles, big main muscle groups that produce the propulsion force mainly for swimming, okay, in general. So over here, what you want to do is choose exercises that targets this muscle group. So over here, what we're looking at will be your squat pattern. So you need to work that squat pattern that works the lower limb. You also want to work with your push and pull component. So here, your pec, we're kind of working on the push factor. It can be horizontal, it can be vertical. It will have to be both as well, because when you're swimming, you're kind of in a way working on different vectors. So there are many different vectors that your limbs are kind of producing the force. So working on your push, working on your pull, and then working on your squat pattern will in a way help in terms of that swimming ability. So again, we are not talking about choosing specific exercises that look like what you do in swimming. So in a way, what we're trying to do here is to target these movement patterns so that in hope to see transference from strength gains to performance on, in this case, your pull. So over here, you're also asking about how we can measure and improve power, acceleration, and reaction time. So if you recall over one of the slides RJ was sharing, so he showed some of our national athletes, one of them being Amanda. So Amanda is actually one of our, she's our sprint queen in the pool, basically. So in that slide itself, RJ showed the strength for pull-up. So that actually is a 1 RM or 1 repetition maximum test that is commonly done in the strength conditioning field to test basically how strong one is. So over there, that is a pull-up 1 repetition maximum test. So basically, from that, it kind of shows that she previously lifted 27.5 kilograms of external force that she's using doing the pull-up. And then versus now, she's doing a 37.5 kilograms of force external weight that she's adding on to. So an increment of about 10 kg. And then that kind of reduced her sprint time from 25.69 to 24.41. So in a way, one repetition maximal test is one that is really commonly used. So what you can work with is also 1 RM test for the said muscle groups that are required to help, that can kind of in a way help in the sport. So here I'm talking about your lats. So here we have your pull-ups, and then for your lower limb, your quad force generation, we can look at your 1 RM squat. So how many times you can kind of, how much of a weight you can kind of lift with your squat. And then we can also look at that push component of things. So in this case, we are looking at your bench press, how heavy you can kind of lift just one time at all. So these are some test parameters that you can kind of, in a way, incorporate in the strength conditioning field. But again, how much of a translation this has to actual swim performance? Again, RJ has mentioned there are many other various factors that can be involved as well that allows you to improve your overall performance. In this case, we're talking about your reaction and things like that. These are abilities that in a way kind of just happen on the ground itself. So a very good way to test sport-specific needs or sport-specific timings will be just do the sport itself. In this case, you can just get the sprint time itself because that factors in all the other factors already. So I hope that answered your question a little.
Thanks, Kelvin. We just have a second question. Apart from squats, what are some other lower limb exercises I can do with my water polo boys to help them do better at their 8-meter kicks, forward, backward, walking in water?
Okay, hang on. So another question from Jack C. So this is with water polo guys. So nice. I actually work with water polo. So the thing here is that okay, again, it depends on how young they are. So if let's say they are kind of in a way novices, fresh, have no, okay, they have 9 to 11. Okay, nice. That's a very fresh group. So generally because I've worked with generally youth or adolescent kids in that age group as well for other sports. But generally people in this group, what I get them to really focus on is to kind of in a way master the foundational movement patterns. In this case, you want to, their water polo players, you really need them to be really strong in terms of their upper body structure. So that push-pull movement will be very, very important, very crucial for them to be able to get. And then the squat and hinge pattern as well in terms of getting the endurance in the lower limb. So what I mean, the age group is not at the point that they are getting really competitive as well. So in this age group, I would generally suggest that you can kind of in a way focus more on getting them to master the foundational movement patterns and work more in terms of the endurance range of things. So I'm talking about here, getting them to be comfortable with squatting with good form for maybe 15 reps all the way to 30 repetitions with their body weight. And then you can progressively start incorporating some weights with bands, with resistance bands, with dumbbells and things like that to up that endurance strength required in terms of having that lower limb endurance for them to do that 8-meter repeatedly. So I hope that answered your question a little. So mastering the basics, and then as they're older, then we can work with other components of things.
Okay, thanks, Kelvin. We just have a third question. In terms of injury prevention, what lower limb exercises will you recommend to prevent knee-related injuries?
Norman has this question. In terms of injury prevention, what lower limb exercises will you recommend to prevent knee-related injuries? I think I can leave this to RJ. What do you think? Probably my thoughts are, I don't think I can prevent that knee injury. But RJ has his thoughts, so let's maybe let him share a little.
Yeah, you can't prevent it.
Yeah.
I think so. Yes, we know that term injury prevention sort of exists in the sports world. I think you've got to use that term very carefully, and we've got to understand that term rather carefully. Number one, you can't prevent injuries. That is the harsh reality of sport. You simply cannot. And if there's somebody who can guarantee you that they can prevent knee injuries, please let me know the guy, because he's probably earning quite a maybe a few $100,000, and I would like to join him, see what he's doing. But you can't prevent injuries. You can minimize the risk of it. Just to be very clear about that. Number two, I think the term knee-related injuries is rather ambiguous. There's an echo. All right, that should be better. Thanks, Lawrence. It's rather ambiguous, so I'm just going to try and keep it as simple as possible. This is a general answer. It is not your 100% answer, but it's a very general answer. So number one, with knee-related injuries, we kind of want to take a look not just at the knee itself, but we want to look at above the knee and below the knee. So are your athletes having knee issues because of issues with their hip? Is there a lack of mobility within the hips in different planes of movements? Is there a lack of strength in the hips in the different planes of movements? And that's one you want to look at. And then we want to look below the knee as well. We want to look at the foot complex, the ankle complex. Is there a lack of range within the ankle complex? Is there a lack of strength as well within that ankle complex? So I think those are two things we can look at. Again, it's a general answer. Number two, to put it very simply, if you want to prevent knee injuries, then strengthen the stuff that are around the knee. So we're looking at getting stronger in your quads. We're looking at getting stronger in the hamstrings, looking at getting stronger in the glutes, looking at getting stronger within the calves. That's pretty much what's connected to your knee in essence. So you kind of want to look at that. Now, if you go into more detail about that, then we're talking about working the hamstrings eccentrically or the quads eccentrically. How much portion are you going to spend time working eccentrically as opposed to working on it concentrically? And we talk about the glutes. The glutes are the powerhouse of number three. Sorry, the glutes are the powerhouse of your body. You want the glutes to be strong in different directions. In that linear direction, in that lateral directions as well. And there are more answers to it, but again, just being very general here. Number four, besides just looking at above, below, looking at the specific muscle groups, you also want to develop strength in the movement patterns that are required for your sport. So if my sport requires me to spend a great degree of time on a single leg, which to be honest, a lot of team sports do, you're spending a fair bit of time on your single legs when you're running or when you're jumping into challenges or trying to avoid or change directions. It's a lot of single leg work going on there. So I'm looking at getting my athletes stronger in movement patterns that occur in their sport. So i.e. to say, if I'm doing hamstring curls, for example, and I'm having a very slow eccentric tempo, yes, I'm working on my hamstring strength eccentrically, which is important in minimizing the risk of knee injuries. But I also want to translate that or have an application effect from that into doing movements that are relevant to my sport. So if, again, a general example, if I'm looking at a team sport, a soccer, basketball, then I want to maybe I want to be looking at doing movements like a single leg Romanian deadlift. Let's say that single leg work, I'm still working the entire lower body in that movement, and that's one movement in the linear plane. Now, if I'm looking at something like in the lateral plane, then maybe I'm looking, if I'm going to take the single leg deadlift, maybe from that single leg deadlift, I go into a single leg hop, either to the left or to the right. Single leg Romanian deadlift, sorry. Yeah. So just general answers, But I think these are things you could look at in minimizing the risk of knee-related injuries. I don't know if Cal has anything else to add, but that's pretty much it from me.
Okay, thanks, Kelvin and Ronald. So if there's no further questions, we will move on to the
I have
reflection.
a question from somebody here was asking about where can I find out more information of the foundational movement patterns. So basically, we in a way compile these movement patterns based on those patterns that we generally work within the gym setting. So I'm talking about your barbell back squat, your Romanian deadlift or deadlifts, your barbell bend over row, dumbbell bend over rows, your pull-ups and things like that. So basically we compile all these movement patterns because we feel that there's this need for individuals or a novice, generally the younger ones, to get used to these foundational movement patterns before we can actually allow them to come into the gym to load up their movement patterns. Right, so this is actually a compilation on our side. So I believe if let's say you go onto Google itself, you can search for a term foundational movement patterns as well. There will be tons of sites that have this movement as well. So over here, we will also share the Back to Basics document with you. So in itself, we compiled that some of these resistance band exercises that are already shown in some of those videos, in some of the previous slides. So that will also highlight a little some of the foundational movement patterns a little more in detail. So that will be shared with you as well. Then if let's say you have further questions, feel free to ask us again.
Okay, thanks, Kelvin and Ronald. We'll move on to
So if you go online on Google and things like that, you can search for foundational movement patterns. Some will term it as also functional movement patterns. It all are pretty much the same term, because what we are trying to address here is the basic movement that we as human kind of in a way how we function. Yeah, just as a gauge. Hope that answered your question a little.
Yeah, thanks, Kelvin and Ronald. We will move on to the reflection session right now.